Hey, friends! Please like and subscribe for more amazing stories! My name is Sarah Cox, and this is the story of how I single-handedly stopped a murder. Ever since I moved to town, I've lived in the same little neighborhood. It's a really fancy neighborhood, and most of the houses are really big and expensive. I work in a simple flower shop, so I could only afford the smallest house in the neighborhood. It only has one bedroom, and my neighbor says that it used to be a shed attached to one of the bigger houses. It was really cramped in the house, even though I was the only one living there. So, I spent a lot of time at work. One day at work, a customer came in with a very strange request.
I need the strongest flowers you have.
The strongest flowers? Do you mean the flowers that will last the longest? Just then, his phone started ringing.
Just find me flowers that won't wilt if they're covered in poison. I can't waste time explaining this to you. I have to take this call.
I still didn't really understand why Albert would want something like that. But I'd always been taught to listen to my customers. Maybe he worked in a place with a lot of hazardous chemicals, and he needed a flower that wouldn't wilt. I started to put together a bouquet of the hardiest flowers I had in the shop. While I was making the bouquet, I could hear the customer talking on the phone.
Yes, I already have the poison. I'm getting the flowers now.
Someone on the other side of the phone said something, but I couldn't hear what.
She's already sick. It won't take much poison to do the job. We'll have that old house in no time at all. Then, we'll both be rich.
I was horrified by what the conversation seemed to imply. Was he planning on killing someone to take their house? With poison? Was that why he wanted flowers that wouldn't wilt if he put poison on them? Was he going to use the flowers to transport the poison?
Are those flowers ready yet? I feel like I've been waiting forever.
I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to give him the flowers if he was going to use them to poison somebody. But if I didn't sell him the flowers, I wouldn't have enough money to buy dinner that night. I felt really bad about it, but I sold him the bouquet. I needed to be able to eat that night. After I was done working at the flower shop, I went home. I felt really guilty about the flowers, especially when I was eating the food I bought with the money I'd earned. While I was eating, I looked out the window. To my surprise, in the window of the house across the street, I saw the very same bouquet I had put together that afternoon. I was really confused when I saw the bouquet. I knew the neighbor who lived in that house. It wasn't the young, angry man who had come into the shop that afternoon. It was a nice, old woman named Mrs. Donnelly, who knitted sweaters for all the kids in the neighborhood and brought cookies door to door during the holidays. Then, I had a horrible thought. What if the person he had been talking about poisoning in the flower shop had been Mrs. Donnelly? Terrified, I ran over to Mrs. Donnelly's front door. I knocked as hard as I could. I had to warn her. But when the door opened, it wasn't Mrs. Donnelly at the door. It was the angry young man from the flower shop. What are you doing here?
What do you mean, what am I doing here? I live here.
But this is where Mrs. Donnelly lives.
We both live here. I'm Albert Donnelly. Miss Donnelly's grandson. I'm staying here with her while she's sick to help take care of her.
He may have sounded sweet, but because of what I'd heard at the flower shop, I was worried that he wasn't actually taking care of her, but instead poisoning her. Could I come in and see her, please?
No, she's much too sick to have visitors right now.
He closed the door in my face, but I was still worried. I crept over to the window, where I saw Mrs. Donnelly lying sick in the bed. As I watched, Albert came into the room. He took the bouquet from the windowsill and put it closer to his grandmother.
Here, Grandma, why don't you smell these flowers for me?
Not right now, Albert. I'm really very hungry. Do you think you could bring me something to eat?
We can worry about food later, Grandma. For now, just enjoy the flowers. I spent a lot of money on them.
And they really are beautiful flowers, Albert. I really do appreciate how you take care of me. I just could really use some food right now. That's all.
You don't appreciate my effort at all, do you? I'm not going to bring you anything to eat until you've actually paid attention to the flowers I brought you.
Albert stormed out of the room. I knew he wasn't angry because Mrs. Donnelly didn't appreciate the flowers. He was really just angry because she hadn't breathed in the poison he must have put on the flowers. I knew then that I had to save Mrs. Donnelly before Albert succeeded in his plans. I couldn't just go in the front door because then Albert would see me. So instead, I snuck in the window. I warned Mrs. Donnelly about what was happening, and I gave her some of the food from my dinner. Having something to eat seemed to help her regain some of her strength. I can't believe Albert would do something like this. I always thought he was such a good boy. I was going to leave him everything in my will, you know. I know. It's so sad that he could do this to his own grandmother. Thank you for telling me about this, Sarah. And for bringing me food. But I don't know how we're going to stop him from doing the same thing again. I'm too sick to get out of bed. I can't stop him from poisoning me. And if he sees you here, he'll call the police on you for breaking into our house. Don't worry, Mrs. Donnelly. I have an idea. The next day, I brought Mrs. Donnelly a new bouquet of flowers. It looked just like the old bouquet. Except I didn't put poison on the flowers like Albert had. I replaced the flowers at Mrs. Donnelly's house with the new, safe ones. Then, Albert came back into Mrs. Donnelly's room. He didn't know that there were new flowers. And he tried to get his grandmother to breathe in the poison again. Oh, of course I'll appreciate the flowers. Thank you so much, Albert. They smell so lovely. Mrs. Donnelly took a big, deep breath of the flowers. And then, instantly, she fell back onto the bed, eyes shut. Albert smiled and picked up his phone.
Our poison worked. She's finally dead, and the house is ours. I can't believe how much money we're gonna get for selling a place like this.
Right as he admitted what was happening, a police officer broke through the doorway. Mrs. Donnelly and I had called them after I replaced the flowers to prove what was going on. And the officer heard everything. Albert was taken off to jail, and now that she was getting proper care, Mrs. Donnelly started to get better. In the end, Mrs. Donnelly and I became great friends. She was so grateful that I had helped to save her, and she let me move into her nice big house with her to help actually take care of her. She even put me in her will instead of Albert. I was so happy that I had done the right thing and helped her after I found out what Albert was doing. Helping others is always rewarding, even if it's not always in the way you expect.